We now have a keynote speaker who will put the spotlight on the journey to remarkable, reimagining retail in the age of Amazon. Our speaker is a global icon and rock star of the world of retail. He is a strategic advisor and writer on retail innovation and the future of shopping. He was recently named a top 5 global influencer in retail and is a Forbes senior consultant. He has worked with dozens of retail, luxury, and social impact brands to inspire, catalyze, and design their journey from being boring to remarkable. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome President and Founder, SageBerry Consulting, Stephen Dennis.
Let me just start out by what I call 5 critical truths and 1 big lie. The first is what I call the end of scarcity. And by that I mean a lot of the things that were in short supply many, many years ago clearly aren't anymore. The first is really information. I'm trying to look at the audience here. I think we have people from a pretty wide range of ages, but if you're about my age, you probably grew up with only a few places to get information, a few TV stations, radio stations, maybe newspapers or magazines, whereas today, clearly, since the advent of the internet, pretty much anything you want to know about is available almost instantaneously. Product information, pricing, you name it, all of that is available to the consumers pretty much anytime they wanted it to, and it's virtually unlimited. The second thing is access. From a retail standpoint, if you just go back even 10 or 15 years ago, and of course every market's a little bit different, but for the most part our choices were limited to whatever set of stores we happened to have in the town or the city in which we lived in, and we could only buy those things whenever they happened to be open. And today obviously we can shop 24/7, and we're no longer limited by the town we happen to live in, big or small, and whatever choices are there. The other part is choice. Choice is no longer scarce. Again, whatever stores you happen to have, shops you happen to have in your particular city, you had to hope that whatever it was that you were interested in, the color, the size, whatever it might be, was actually available the day or the time that you wanted to buy it. And I don't think this is quite so true in this market, because there are, I know, so many shops and the cost of labor here. But if you think about in a lot of markets, even just by virtue of the internet, finding very low cost items is now very, very easy from just about all over the world. And then convenience is becoming less and less scarce all the time. I'm not as certain about what's going on here in India, but one of the things that's happening in the United States is what I call sort of this war of convenience. A few years ago, if you ordered something, say from a catalog, you'd be lucky to get it maybe in a week's time. And then it's become 2 days' time, and now it's 1 day's time, and now more and more it's becoming even the same day or within a number of hours. And the last one, I think, is this idea of connection no longer being scarce. I think most of us, if you go back 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, our networks were our families, our coworkers, maybe the place we happen to go to worship, or a club we belong to, and now virtually everybody's connected to almost anybody in the whole world, and it's one of these interesting phenomena now. I don't know if you've seen this survey, but people actually tend to trust recommendations from people they don't even know on websites than they do from their own friends. So it's a very different world of connection than we had a few years ago. But the important thing about this is what I often refer to as this idea that good enough no longer is. It used to be in many cases, and I think this is true really throughout the globe, that if you didn't have a lot of choices, if you didn't have a lot of information about what the right products were, or the prices you should pay, and so forth, then you might just be satisfied with whatever happened to be available in your town when you happen to walk into the store, with whatever information you get from the shopkeeper or the salesperson. But today, since that's no longer true, it really puts a burden on everybody in retail, I think, to up their game. And the import, I think, from a customer standpoint is, I don't think any customer really wants to be average. Everybody wants to be a little bit special. But from a retail standpoint, I think the most important thing is you no longer have to be. You can determine what you want and pretty much find it anytime, anywhere, anyway. The third thing I want to talk about just quickly is this idea that we no longer go online, we live online. Probably many of you remember that access to the internet used to be dialing up and you'd wait for the sound to come on and so forth. And now, for most people, wherever you have a smartphone is really wherever you can shop. So the moment that maybe you're standing in line, or maybe you get bored of my talk and you feel like shopping, you just take out your phone and you can do it. There's no longer constrained by going to your home or going to your office. And that fundamentally changes a lot of things. The fourth thing, and I don't know how big a deal this is in this market, but all the time that I've been in retail, working for different retailers, and particularly over the last, I don't know, 10 years, there's a lot of discussion of the different shopping channels. In fact, I'll talk about this idea of omni-channel in a second. And we talk about the e-commerce channel and the physical store channel. But really, I don't think, particularly with smartphones, that this idea of different channels even really makes much sense anymore. We really have to think about the customer being the channel and not get caught up in these kind of arbitrary ways of keeping track, which means that really, instead of e-commerce or brick and mortar commerce, it's really all just commerce. The fifth thing I'll mention just very briefly, and this I'll get into a little bit more in a second, and again, I don't know how true it is in this market, but because of some of these trends, it's getting harder and harder to be in the middle of the market. And by that I mean, if you think about on the, say, the left-hand side, you think about those retailers, Flipkart, others that are very focused on convenience, huge assortment, low prices. On the other end of the spectrum, you have retailers that, say, have more unique or special product, or very luxurious shops, or maybe amazing service. But these retailers that don't necessarily have the best price, they're not the most convenient, they don't offer a very good experience, they're the ones that are really having trouble more and more, particularly as e-commerce grows. And before I show some statistics, what I notice, and I've been probably in 12 or 13 countries in the last year, and no matter where I go, I still see a lot of retail that looks pretty similar no matter where you are. You have websites that look the same. You have storefronts and malls that pretty much look the same. All the signage, all the displays, a lot of the marketing promotions are often pretty similar, which makes it hard for the customer to really figure out what's special and what's unique. And so again, I think this is causing this collapse of the middle. Now, and this is just United States information, but Deloitte Consulting did a study of US retail where, and I hope you can see this okay, they put retailers in these three categories basically that I mentioned, the more price value oriented ones, which is the blue, the pink or whatever that is, more premier experiential high-end retailers, and then really the retailers that didn't cleanly fit in either category. And if you look at what's happened over the last 5 years, and there's much more detail in their study, from a revenue growth standpoint, you've seen quite a lot of growth in the US from these high-end retailers, more experiential, service-oriented retailers, quite a lot of growth in the more value, price-oriented retailers, but almost no growth, in fact, growth below inflation in these retailers that are in the middle. And from a store closing standpoint, you can see the same phenomenon. A huge number of stores still opening, physical stores still opening among price-oriented retailers, pretty good growth on the premier side, but a net loss of store openings on the part of these retailers in the middle. So when you think about what's really going on, a lot of the problems in retail or the challenges are really concentrated in this group that's in the middle, and I think it's getting harder and harder to really make that work. So the big lie I talk about, and I don't know how popular this is in India, but there's been a lot of talk in the US in particular about the so-called retail apocalypse, and I think that's really misleading. Now, it is true in the US, and I know the UK and many markets, we are seeing a lot of store closings. In fact, in the US, it's predicted that as many as 12,000 stores will close by the end of this year, and that's even more than 2017, which was a record year. And we have some, I don't know how many of these retailers you would know since most of these are North American based, but there are quite a lot of retailers, including these four, which are all more than 100 years old. They do billions of business, and they're all really struggling to navigate this industry change. We've seen quite a lot of bankruptcies as well. Something like 30 or 40 major retailers in North America have gone out of business, including some very large ones like Radio Shack, Payless, Toys R Us, that basically have closed all their stores and have disappeared. And then, of course, and I know this is a big topic of discussion here in India, Amazon has gone from just selling CDs and books 20 years ago or so to really being in pretty much every single category and growing very, very rapidly and changing a lot of the dynamics in the market. So it's a very challenging environment, to be sure. But it's also true, sorry, I think I lost, so we can go back one. But it's also true, and again, US statistics, but I think we're seeing similar trends in most major markets, that physical retail is not going away. So first, if you look at the growth rate, clearly the big difference is that e-commerce is growing at a much, much faster rate than physical store growth. But even with the talk of the retail apocalypse, physical retail is still growing. If you look at the share, and there's some different statistics, but they're all pretty much the same, physical retail accounts for almost 90% of all retail, and then e-commerce close to 11%. And then I think the most interesting thing is if you look at the dollar growth, so the incremental growth accounted for by the two different channels, physical retail is still actually contributing more total growth because it's small percentage growth on a bigger base than e-commerce. And the fact is, there's still a lot of stores that are being opened, not as many as are being closed, but there are going to be probably 4,000 or 5,000 new stores that are being opened in the US despite the talk of the retail apocalypse. And I've looked at some data in Australia and UK, and we're seeing some similar trends. One of the things that's most ironic is that a number of these brands, I don't know how many you would be familiar with because they're still mostly in the US, but these brands that started online and said that they would never open stores, like Bonobos, Warby Parker, or many others, are actually opening quite a lot of stores, and many of them are saying they can't even be profitable unless they open physical stores. So Bonobos now, I think, has about 70 stores. A bunch of other number of these brands have announced hundreds and hundreds of stores that they're going to be opening. So when you look at that store count, there are many traditional retailers that have been around a long time opening stores, but there are also a lot of these newer so-called disruptive brands that are. So what I think is actually more accurate to say is not that physical retail is dead, because again, you have many retailers that have been around for a while, some of these newer brands like Casper that are opening hundreds of stores. It's really that boring, mediocre, undifferentiated, these retailers that are in the middle are really the places that are dying. So what I want to spend the rest of my time on quickly is to talk about this place we find ourselves where many retailers have obviously already gotten themselves into a lot of trouble. Some are very much at the edges trying to figure out what they need to do next. Others are getting closer and closer to this edge, and I would argue if they don't change very quickly and dramatically, they may find themselves in the same sort of trouble that we saw with some of those bankrupt retailers. So I think we have a very fundamental choice. On the one hand, we can choose to go much more towards that direction of price, convenience, assortment, et cetera, or you can try to go to this more service, experientially oriented retail. And I think the challenge is if you're going to go towards the price, convenience, assortment side, the problem is you're probably going to end up competing with folks like Walmart, Flipkart, Amazon that just have enormous, enormous advantages. And so I think for most of us, that's not really a choice. The choice is going to be how do we make ourselves more different, more special, more experiential, and what I call choosing to be fundamentally more remarkable. So I've developed this, excuse me, I've developed this framework that I call the 8 Essentials of Remarkable Retail, which will be in my book that's coming out in a little bit. These are the 8. I'm not going to have time to talk about all 8, but at the end I will give you my email, and if you want to get a little bit more detail on all 8, I'd be happy to send you some more information. But I want to talk about 3, and I picked these 3 partially for the time I had, but also because I think in many cases these are the ones that are most interesting or central to what many retailers need to do to change. So the first one I call, harmonized. Let's see if I can just go back. Anyway, I keep going. The first one I call harmonized, which is really my term for omni-channel. I've grown a little bit tired of the term omni-channel. I know that's all over the place here. But I don't think that the idea of omni-channel is to try to be, or the way it's applied, to try to be everywhere. The idea is to try to show up in places where it really matters. And part of the reason why it's really important, and again, these are US statistics, but I've seen a few other markets which is similar, is that actually digitally influenced brick and mortar sales are much, much bigger than e-commerce. This is not to say that e-commerce as a separate channel isn't important, but when we think about the shopping experience, we think about digital influence. It's actually more important how digital tends to affect brick and mortar store sales, and most customers shop in multiple channels anyway. So this idea of harmonized is really, how do we treat the customer as the channel? How do we go forward as one brand in many channels? The reason why I picked the term harmonized more than omnichannel is really to stress this idea that the whole shopping experience has to work beautifully together. So if you think about it from a music standpoint, it's eliminating those off notes or discordant notes or friction or pain points, whatever we want to call them, while at the same time trying to find those things that really make us special and trying to amplify those in a harmonious way. The thing that I find, and again, I'm not so sure about this market, but where I see retailers struggling in the US, it's often still this mentality of different silos. So we have an e-commerce channel, a brick and mortar channel, we may have multiple databases, we may have multiple places where our inventory is, marketing that's maybe not so well coordinated. And what I have found working at a couple retailers on these sorts of things over the years is until you break down those silos, which usually the CEO has to make happen, you're really not going to make that much progress, even if you have great technology or great desires. So one of the things we're seeing in the US, which I think is pretty interesting, particularly in the last, I would say, year or so, there was really this narrative that what most retailers needed to do was close stores, that stores were a burden. But many retailers, including some big ones like Target and Walmart, are really seeing that the key is to think about your stores as assets, not necessarily liabilities, and figure out how you can change them in a way that works beautifully in concert with everything else you're doing. So they have definitely gotten better in e-commerce, but I think in particular what they've said is, okay, let's understand the whole customer journey. Let's figure out how these stores can better serve customers however it is they choose to shop. And so it's this idea of the blur between the different channels that I think we have to really figure out, understand the customer journey, and then figure out how stores can work better in this context. So Walmart, Target, a number of these retailers that have been around forever that many people thought Amazon was really going to not necessarily put out of business, but hurt significantly, are now seeing better growth, better profits, particularly in the last year or so as they've embraced this strategy. So I'm going to try to go a little bit faster because I'm running out of time. The other thing I think is interesting to look at is how some of these so-called digitally native vertical brands are also doing this. Now they have a great advantage of having started online and being very analytically oriented and having most of their customers used to dealing with them digitally, and then picking stores and locations that are right for this time. You know, many retailers are stuck with locations that are, you know, many, many years old, maybe not in the right place anytime, too big, et cetera. But I think they're worth studying to see how they really take this overall harmonized approach as they execute their physical strategy, as opposed to many physical retailers that are now trying to figure out how to be more digitally savvy. So let me talk about the next one, memorable, very quickly. So here's a quiz. Does anybody know what store this is? So I've done this about 30 or 40 times, and I usually just get people that just, you know, say whatever department store or whatever that they happen to know. I actually don't know what store this is. I just picked on Google whatever department store I thought looked the most generic, because I think this is the sea of sameness we see, where there are a lot of stores that all basically look the same, whether you're in Sydney or Dublin or what have you. Now, people know what store this is? Okay, so every time I've done this too, everybody instantly says Apple. Now, I'm not saying that it's all about design, but clearly some brands are able to really create an instant visual that makes you say, okay, I know who this is, I know what this is about, and you probably like them. So when I say memorable, there's a few key aspects. Certainly being unique is a big part of it. But you know, you can be different and not be relevant to the customer. So the more you understand the customer, the more you can meet their needs. Obviously, that's important. And then it's really this idea of amplifying the wow. You know, what is that thing that's really going to be so special that people will literally talk about it? So when I say remarkable, I mean it in the sense that some of you may know Seth Godin's work, where he talks about people are willing, they're so affected by it, they're willing to keep talking about it and spread your story. What I'll do just very quickly is give you a few examples, most of these from the US, of what different retailers are doing to be more remarkable, to be more memorable. So this is a home furnishing store called Restoration Hardware. at a time when most retailers are closing stores or thinking, and/or I guess thinking about making them smaller, Restoration Hardware's gone in the totally different direction. They've taken stores that used to be much smaller. Now they're building these huge palaces of home furnishings with very elaborate decor, restaurants, in some cases swimming pools. It's really pretty crazy, but they continue to open these stores and they've had very, very good results. Starbucks is doing kind of a similar thing. Instead of some of their smaller coffee shops, they're now starting to open these things they call roasteries. This happens to be, I believe, Shanghai. But this is a new strategy for them. These massive stores, they're brewing coffee beans right in there. They have augmented reality, virtual reality to try to tell you the stories about this. Coffee concierges, the whole thing, beyond just having more space to sit. At the other end of the spectrum are some retailers that are taking different strategies to get smaller and closer to the customer. So I don't know if you're familiar with Nordstrom. Nordstrom in the US is an upscale department store, very large stores. They're starting to open what they call their local concepts, which I'll just show you the inside, actually has no regular merchandise in there. The idea here is really a store that's closer to where you live and work, where you can go and experience some of their services. But mostly what it's become is a place to order online and pick up your items. So if you can see, there's a lot of packages here that customers have ordered online. They're coming in to pick up the product in a place that they can get in and out of much more easily than going to a big mall, having to park in the parking deck and so forth. So these now, they have several of these in Los Angeles. They just opened New York, and really I think it's a strategy to get more market share by putting more and more locations into a particular area. Different ways people are reinventing the experience. This is a concept called Eataly. I don't know if Eataly's in India. I know they're in about, I think, 10 or 15 countries now, where they really are blending grocery-type products with dining. So they have everything from gelato, coffee, wine bar, very fancy restaurants, along with just the products that you can take home. This is a Chinese grocery store. If you haven't taken a look at some of the things that Alibaba in particular is doing, their so-called new retail in China, I would really encourage you to. This supermarket, which was originally called Heima, is now called Fresh Hippo. It's interesting both in that they're doing things like, allowing you to pick out the seafood and having it prepared there, but the whole store is really experienced through a mobile device, where the mobile is really augmenting all the experience. They're using that data to keep personalizing the experience. One of my favorite things, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up. This is a company called Canada Goose, high-end outerwear company. What they've done with their dressing rooms is they've actually turned them into freezers, walk-in freezers. And so this is a chance for you to try on the product in the real-life experience to see why you should pay all this money for a coat to keep you warm. To me, when we talk about experiential retail, I think there's a lot of gimmicks. This is something to me that really makes a lot of sense, because not only is it interesting, people put Instagram posts, people will talk about it, but it actually tells you why or helps you understand why the product is worth what you pay and the value you get out of it. The concept they call stores is theater. This is Nike House of Innovation in Shanghai and New York. If you find yourself in New York, there's many interesting things to see in this store in terms of how they're using technology. But in particular, this is their custom sneaker shop. And so you can go in and pick out the different style of shoe you want and all the different colors. But the really interesting thing is right next door, there's this little laboratory where you get to watch the artisans actually craft the shoe for you and sort of experience that as a theatrical performance almost before you take your product home. In the interest of time, I'll skip this one. Another Nike concept that I think is interesting, they call Nike Local or Nike Live, where they're building these smaller stores in different communities and really making them very, very specific to that neighborhood. So about 25% of the product changes and the services and other things they have, the design, are very much tailored to that particular community rather than kind of the typical Nike store. And the last one I'll mention, you may be familiar with, is Amazon Go. This is cashierless checkout, which I think is going to be very, very important. It's a little unclear how aggressive Amazon is going to expand these. They've got maybe 8 or 9 so far. There are rumors they may open thousands of them. There are rumors that the cost is too high and they're trying to figure out how to make it more scalable. Okay, very quickly, the third one I call radical. And You know, what I've observed and worked from some retailers that have struggled to change and some that have done better is that most of the retailers that get into trouble, they really have not understood how quickly they need to change. That somehow there's a line that they're afraid to cross in terms of the way they define their market or the things they're willing to try or the risks they're willing to take, and they've basically watched the last 10, 15, 20 years happen to them as other retailers, disruptors have come along and stolen their market share. I like what my friend Seth says about this, which is if failure is not an option, then neither is success, which may seem like an obvious point, but if you really look at a lot of the retailers around the world that haven't navigated well, most of them have not been willing to experiment as much as I think they probably should, where some of these disruptors are much more willing to take these risks. And to me, it's really about building a fundamental culture of experimentation. You know, that's too hard today, I think, to figure out what's going to work. You have to try lots and lots of experiments. The ones that don't work, kill them quickly. The ones that do work, scale them very, very rapidly. You know, a lot of people obviously pay attention to Amazon and understand how successful they've been. But the reality is Amazon fails a lot. They've failed at their phones. They failed at this thing called Amazon Restaurants, where they spent tens of millions of dollars, didn't work. Jeff Bezos, in one of the analyst reports, said that one of the best successes of the year was that Amazon had something like 5,000 failed experiments. So it's a whole different mindset to say that, you know, our success is going to be partially measured by how many times we failed. So I think that's the balance you need to strike. Okay, I'm out of time, so I'm going to try to wrap up quickly. So these are the three I talked about today. I hope maybe you got a few ideas of things that you might want to think about or could possibly be applied to your business. As I mentioned, there are 8 overall. When you see my email, if you send me an email, I'll tell you a little bit more about what this is about, and it'll also be focused in my book that's coming out next year. But let me just wrap up and talk about this Chinese proverb, which perhaps some of you have heard, which is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So I hope when you have an opportunity to choose remarkable, you do so. I hope you're willing to perhaps fail a little bit more, but if you do, fail quickly, and I hope you get started. Thanks for your attention, and I think we have a couple minutes for questions. Thank you. Anybody have a question? Try not to fall off the stage.
Hi, I'm a retailer, and on one of your slides you mentioned web influence sales have gone up.
I'm sorry?
Web influenced sales?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So what exactly do you mean by web influenced sales?
Okay.
I didn't get that.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So part of the problem in the data that I've seen, which both Forrester and Deloitte have data on this, is they tell you what the definition is, which I'll tell you in a second, but they don't break it out very well. So web influence sale can be anything from somebody going online to see what's the location of the store, what are the hours, you know, something very, very basic, to order online, pick up in store, check inventory. So any time the digital channel has been used prior to completing a transaction counts as a web influence sale. One thing I do know from looking at different categories, as you might expect, is not only are the percentages very different, so if it's an expensive product, you know, people tend to do more research online, furniture, or TV, refrigerator, before going in, whereas other things are more likely just to be very quick and just, you know, ordering it online and picking it up. So I think you really need to dive into it by different categories.
Thank you.
My question is very India specific. So your online and your omni-channel retail suits very well the Western part of the world.
Yes.
Where the Indian culture and the buying habit is deeply ingrained into the touch, feel, and the emotion aspect.
Right.
So now you said the physical store will never go away worldwide, but specifically in India, I see that as a very intrinsic part of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how much can the online live in synchronicity or in alignment with the physical store in India, and what could be the shared size of each?
Sure. So
from the long term and short term perspective.
yeah, so a couple things on that. One is, one of the things that I've seen is the distinction that some people make between what they call buying and shopping. The idea that buying is something where you know exactly what you want, you're very focused just on completing the task, you may not care that much about the brand, and that's where e-commerce tends to do particularly well. Whereas shopping is more something you're likely to do in a store because you want to touch, feel the product, talk to a salesperson, maybe it's social. So I think in general, independent of the market, I think it's very important for every retailer to understand their customer behavior. And so because the buying side is much more prone to be a place where Amazon or Flipkart or others will do well because it's a very easy transaction to complete. The other piece, I think, is just to dive down into really understand why customers choose you and what is the role of the store and how does your particular store stack up against the competition, whether it's online or not. And so I think it's very hard to predict how quickly online will grow, but the more you understand the different customers, the more you understand why they choose online versus store, how they're using digital to influence their purchase, I think that's where you focus your attention. But every retailer is different regardless, I think, of the country. So I don't know if that answered your question exactly.
Okay, I
All
think
right,
we're
good?
completely out of
Thank you.
time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.